Kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of not the Department of Conversation, that's my other one. It's Big Hearing News. We got it in the end. I did a podcast this afternoon, so I got a bit confused there for a second. To Big Hearing News, how are you all? You all good? Hope you're all well. You had a good weekend? Hope you had a good weekend. I feel like I've kind of seen y'all since Thursday night, because Friday night's conversation with Catherine Mangy Ward, well, it wasn't a pre-record. Well, it was a pre-record, but I recorded it on Friday, then uploaded it because it was over an hour, and it seemed to make sense just to play it out. Thanks to you, those of you who jumped in and had a look at it. I found it to be a really interesting conversation. I'm not really too au fait with the idea of libertarianism. When I say not too au fait, I guess what I'm saying is it's not been something I've really delved into. I think that what I come away from it going, I feel like pure libertarianism is actually kind of a selfish what's best for me. But what pure libertarianism is, what's best for me and what's best for you, and what's best for you, and what's best for you. And if we all get what's best for us, and that's a democracy. Whereas, of course, the problem with libertarianism, and I used to say this to Rodney Hyde when I used to interview him on ZB, as Rodney Hyde would always say, oh, I always vote for what brings freedom. I always vote for what brings freedom. And I would always say, but what happens when your freedom might actually be oppressive for someone else? You know, what happens if your right to do something impinges on someone else's right to do something? So, yeah, I think to summarize the conversation, and I was watching a little bit of I spent a little bit of time in the chat and watched a little bit of it, just monitored to make sure everything was working well and to get rid of all the porn pop-ups that were coming along. I think ultimately, what I've realized is pure libertarianism has almost zero empathy. I think that's where I landed, because it actually takes empathy to kind of go, those people need a hand up or a help more than I do. Like their rights or the benefit for them should supersede me. And that requires empathy. And albeit I think a lot of libertarians would say, well, you know, we're totally for helping people. But there's no mandate to do it. There's no requirement to do it. Whereas under the system we have sort of now, or a non-libertarian system, government takes on that role of looking after people who can't look after themselves, whereas the pure libertarian view is more like, you know, charity should do that job, I think. Anywho, I found it a good conversation. I see that some people got frustrated with it in the chat, which was kind of interesting to watch. I got to tell you as well, and we had a group catch up on Saturday morning. One of the things I said to them, which I'll say to you, is if you found it a bit frustrating, oh well, that's life. But that was planned to be a 10 to 15 minute chat about the midterms and about President Trump announcing. That's what that was about. And it turned very quickly into an hour-long conversation because Catherine said something about voting, and it made me think, well, who does a libertarian vote for? And it just rolled on. So probably if we were to do that again, I might have some different angles and questions and perspectives, because I would have come in a bit better research. But it was more of a general chit-chat, that one, as opposed to a sort of hardcore, well-prepared conversation. Although I think it was still fun and enlightening. Is that right? Something like that. Hey, so tonight I'd be very keen to get your input on this if you're watching. Excuse me while I just sniff. I had my my booster shot on Thursday afternoon, and they say that sometimes you can get a few of the symptoms of a cold for a couple of days, and I think I might have that. It's a little bit of phlegm, nothing serious though. But yeah, there's a little bit of a tickle going on there, so we'll see that out. What was I going to say? Tonight, I feel like because Friday was we did the hour on libertarianism, we missed a fairly big story, and since then some other very big stories have come up, and it hasn't given me the chance to address the big story from Friday yet. The big story from Friday was basically National talking about bringing back boot camps, all that kind of thing. I didn't have a chance to address it on Friday. And to be honest, since then, we've had hate speech legislation proposed. We've had the voting age today talked about being lowering with the Supreme Court ruling. That's quite big news. And I think we're going to address that one tomorrow night about the National Party and their boot camp and their tough on crime stance. Because tonight we've got a couple of guests coming on to have a chat with us. One of which is from Auckland Pride. Max Tweedie, and he is talking to us about the legislation change in hate speech, which is sort of a non-legislation change. Now, I explained all this in the conversation with Max, so I won't bore you too much with it now. But you guys know that I certainly lean more towards the more speech rather than less speech. I'm not a purist, and I understand that there are some things that we shouldn't and will never be talked about in broadcast. I would never be comfortable hosting a conversation about why it's good for teens to commit suicide. But if you're like a pure free speech person, then that would be okay for that to be spoken about. I don't want to be a part of that. So what I'm saying is, for me, there's a line, right? So I'm not a pure free speechist in the slightest. I understand that some restrictions are necessary and appropriate, but if I was to err on one side or the other, I tend to err towards more speech rather than less. So for people like me, there have been some significant concerns around what they're going to do to hate speech laws, who's going to monitor it, who's going to be the person in charge. And what's come out in the last 48 hours or so is the government has spent 2 years looking into this and sort of done nothing. They've made one change and they've added one word, and really the communities that were, well, I guess two of the other communities that were most looking for the government to step in on their behalf, whether I agree with it or not, have been left out in the cold. It's a really bizarre situation. One of the communities is the rainbow community. They've sort of been left out in the lurch, so to speak. And it's the religious communities that have got protection under the hate speech laws, which is bizarre because I cover this off, so I don't want to go over it now, but I don't feel like religion, and I'm talking about broad, the whole thing, is a particularly vulnerable group. Now, yes, there was a atrocity that happened a couple of years ago that caused the Muslim community within New Zealand to hit that vulnerable status without question. Still there now, without question. But that compared to, the vulnerability that's facing the LGBT community, I don't see how a government can go religion, the religion group, the religion subclass is more vulnerable than the LGBT community. I don't get it. And it feels like the government's kind of just, they've done a Royal Commission. The Royal Commission was based on the mosque attack. The Royal Commission talked about what should be done. It was all primarily driven around religion. And so the way they've kind of, quote unquote, got out of it, the government that is to just stick to the religious group being added and not have to worry about any other groups. It's quite bizarre. And we talk about that. I won't go any further into it, but I found it to be quite bizarre. Almost aside from my thoughts around hate speech legislation, what the government seems to have done is made it worse for everybody almost on some level. And we'll get to that. Also, the voting age to be reduced. Well, I'm completely extrapolating to the nth degree there. Supreme Court ruling today potentially leading to an idea that the voting age could be reduced. I'd love to know from you in the chat what you think about that. There's two questions really to that. Do you think the voting age should be reduced to 16? Right. Question number one. Question number two, will it be reduced to 16? So there is plenty of writing today which kind of says it's a bit of a dead duck because it needs a 75% majority, and National Act have already said we're never voting against it. Now, National Act are saying we're never going to support this because I would propose that 80%, a huge proportion of the people who are voting who are 16 or 17 would give their vote to the left. So I don't think that's ever going to be voted for by the right, which probably means the voting age is never going to change. But still, as a bit of a thought experiment, what do you think? Should it be lowered in an ideal world? Should it be lowered? And then will it be lowered? There's a couple of questions for you. And also we'll have a bit of a look at Trump on Twitter. Again, it's Elon Musk is becoming sadder and sadder and sadder and more pathetic. I heard someone say the other day, that the image he had carrying the sink into Twitter at the start, let that sink in, that terrible dad joke that he made. There's a lot of memes going around talking about how he has caused Twitter to sink. He sunk Twitter. So it's kind of come back to bite him in the ass a little bit. John Oliver on Last Week Tonight did a very good piece on it this evening, New Zealand time, which is very funny to watch. You should check it out. Go Google Last Week Tonight with John Oliver and have a look at the kind of 7 minutes that they do on Twitter from when Elon took over to now. It's pretty enlightening if you don't know all the details. Right. Okay, so let's get into this. Look, there is some messages that have already come in. I'll get to these now. It's just me and Nala here tonight. Me and Nala. Wait. Yep. All right. So I'll get to the chats as I can. Simple says the changes to the hate laws didn't hit the mark. We need to take the Alex Jones component and provide protection against that type of attack to ensure we are keeping up with technology. Peter says pure libertarian is an oxymoron in relation to government, isn't it? Look after yourself means I don't need government, ergo no one needs help. Therefore government. Confused? Me too. Yeah, look, I think one of the things we've talked about before is, and I think I said this on Friday night, I think any ism in its purest sense is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, even capitalism, you know, that the cream rises to the top, people support the best products, you know, but what happens, of course, is when things like the global financial crisis hits, all of a sudden the capitalistic model gets turned into a socialistic model. You know what I'm saying? You know, socialism in its purest sense is not a bad thing. It can work. Even communism in its purest sense. What we see is a bastardized versions of all of those. Libertarianism is the same thing. And because we are failed people, failed beings as humans, and when I say we, I mean leaders, people who push themselves to the top, are selfish and greedy and arrogant, we get involved and fuck it up. So I don't think any ism particularly works well, even if in their purest sense they could be interesting. Like libertarianism, for example, should be a centrist place to be in its ideal world, because it gives freedoms and wants freedom of individual for everyone, left and right ideologies. But of course it's not. It's a far right ideology. So yes, it is probably an oxymoron. Jay says, I didn't get how the thing you chose, religion, gets protected, but the two things you don't have a choice in, sexuality and disability, is not. Exactly the point, Jay. Ro, as long as agnostics and atheists are recognized, so if a religious zealot got in my face saying that I will rot in hell, I can make a complaint and expect it to be upheld. Peter says, back to Jay, good point. I look forward to learning more. Simple says, National and ACT are against it. A teenager is more likely to vote Labour and Greens. Yes. Jay says, yes, the Libertarian Party is against lowering the voting age. It's a very, very good point. I support lowering the age of 16-year-olds. It's just as important. It's just important they're not going to get the 75% support. Correct. Rose says it's also discriminatory if an 8-year-old asked to vote and they were told no. National and ACT saying no is just gerrymandering. Someone asked if I'm on Mastodon yet. I actually have applied for an account, and it's been about 5 days and I haven't heard back. So I think, Bradley, you might be involved with Mastodon in New Zealand. You can look into that for me if you want. I've applied for an account. I guess I should go and check my spams, but I've been told you wait for a while and then we come back to you. I've heard back from no one. Kim says, not sure about 16-year-olds, might not be enough frontal lobe development to understand their decisions, but I'm not against it. Well, the thing about the frontal lobe, it doesn't kick in until you're 25. So you could say the same thing about 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23-year-olds as well. But look, we'll get to this conversation. I think we're doing this conversation first, are we? We're doing this conversation first? What's the conversation? Yes, we're doing that conversation first. And finally, before we get to that conversation, teenagers are more politically aware these days than when I was a teenager. They are actively engaged and they see the issues climate change will bring and are pissed off we aren't doing enough. Thank you, Si. Right, so let's get to it right now. Now I'm being brave, and I'm not saying things like, if the audio doesn't play, I'm just trusting it's going to because it seems to be working, but I will keep an eye on the chat if, for example, something doesn't quite work. So I invited on today Make It 16, which is the group that's been pushing for the lowering of the age. Keep the chats going about this. If you hear something you like or dislike, mention it in the chat and I will overlay it over the pre-recorded interview so we can still interact while this is going on. So Sanat Singh was one of the co-directors of Make It 16, and he joined me this afternoon to have a chat about lowering the voting age. Yes, he did. Joining us, the co-director of Make It 16, Sanat Singh. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us today.
Kia ora. Thanks for having me on.
Kia ora. Yeah, hey, listen, big news in the world of Make It 16. Perhaps you'd like to just explain to the audience exactly who you guys as an organization are and what you are striving to achieve. Why don't you let us know all about it while I show people the news story from today?
Cool. So we're a nonpartisan advocacy group that started in 2019 who's trying to lower the voting age for all elections in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we started in 2019. We came from Youth Parliament and we launched a challenge in the High Court on the basis that the Bill of Rights Act says that 16 and 17-year-olds should be free from age discrimination, and a voting age of 18 is therefore discriminatory towards 16 and 17-year-olds. That challenge in the High Court failed initially, and then we took it to the Court of Appeals in 2021, and they came back to us and said that it was unjustified age discrimination, so there was no justification to keep 16 and 17-year-olds from voting. But when they stopped right at the point where we wanted, which was a declaration of inconsistency, which would have basically given a very clear moral and legal message to Parliament to say, look, this is a clear abuse of rights, so you have to do something to amend the law to make sure that those rights aren't abused. And then we took it to the Supreme Court, and today our court result, the result of our hearing came out this morning, and we got the result that, look, it's inconsistent. There is a rights abuse, and Parliament has to do something about it. So it's a really fantastic.
It's a pretty momentous day. There's a couple of things to talk through. 16 and 17-year-olds should be free from age discrimination. That's the first thing that I'd like to talk through, and also the idea of an unjustified age discrimination. Obviously, meaning that you can have a justifiable age discrimination. I don't know. Let's say you're in the under 12s cricket team. Then justifiable discrimination would be not allowing 15-year-olds to play in it. And I'm assuming in the law that would be justified. If you receive the pension at 65, then it's justified discrimination against 45-year-olds who can't get it. So there is discrimination out there based on age, but they're saying this is unjustified age discrimination. I guess what I wanted, I'll read this part of the story of stuff that gave us all the headlines. It says the Supreme Court has strengthened the claim for a change to the voting age with a declaration that the current age of 18 is unjustified discrimination, as you just said. On Monday today, the court decided the current voting age is unjustified discrimination on the basis of age under the Bill of Rights Act, but only Parliament can change the voting age. However, lobby group Make It 16, welcome, says a declaration of the voting age breaches the Bill of Rights Act would send politicians a strong moral message for change. One of my, I guess, ponderances around this in general is if it's unjustified age discrimination to 16 and 17-year-olds, why isn't it unjustified age discrimination to 14 and 15-year-olds?
That's a really good question. And the provision that's set out in the Bill of Rights is the basis of our case. And that provision is that it's everyone that's 16 and above that is free from age discrimination. So but why 16? I guess. I mean, because look, I read through. Look, I'm finding this a really fascinating idea because I've got your website here as well that's going up, and it says the 5 reasons to make it 16. At 18, you already can make important life decisions. There shouldn't be taxation without representation. Many other countries preventing 16, 17-year-olds from voting is unjustified age discrimination, breach of a Bill of Rights. Voting is a fundamental right. Every voice deserves to be heard in a democracy. Now, most of these could apply to a 14 or 15-year-old. Now, not all of them, because you do say you have important responsibilities like driving, medical procedures, consent, leave school, leave home, pay rent, own a firearm. There's probably a couple in there that if you're 15, you can't have. But most of them, bar a couple of things, a 14 and a 15-year-old could make this exact same argument. Now, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't have drawn a line in the sand, but you have by making it 16 and not say 14, because like my kids had paper runs at 12, 13, 14, so there's taxation without representation. Voting is a fundamental right. Every voice deserves to be heard. That's a 14 and a 15-year-old. So what was the I guess what's the legal rationale, and I guess why your decision to stop it at 16? I guess there's a couple of ways to look at it, right? We couldn't have launched a court case without drawing a line in the sand, and that line in the sand was what was legally supplied to us in the Bill of Rights Act, and that was 16 and 17-year-olds. But you make a really good case here about other ages, and I'll draw the context to countries like Canada, which also have litigation efforts happening over there. In Canada's equivalent Bill of Rights, there is no minimum age to be free from age discrimination. So there they have youth litigants that are as old as 12 and 13 arguing for this right to vote. Over here, that was just simply legally impossible because we wouldn't have been able to. But I also think if we think about it politically, and also a little bit tangibly, right, the life experiences a 16 and 17-year-old shares with maybe an 18-year-old is really closely correlated, and also it's probably a reasonable thing to say politically when we have examples overseas of other countries lowering it to 16 first. So that's sort of the rationale that we use to develop an argument for 16 and 17-year-olds. That is to say, there are academics out there who argue for things like universal suffrage. We've had quite a few conversations with them where they say, look, any restriction that is applied to a group of people in a democratic society is unjustified, absolutely. As a movement, we don't agree with that because we are Make It 16. We have political viability and legal viability to draw the line at 16. But yeah, there's certainly conversations about lowering the voting age even further. As a group, we're not advocating for that, though.
I think I mean, like, from where I sit politically, which is definitely on the left, right? I can see this as being an advantageous, because I would think a higher proportion of people who are 16 and 17 would swing left than right. So actually, as a voting bloc, I kind of think this would probably be quite useful as a voting bloc if you are a left-leaning person like me. However, I'm also someone who can walk and chew gum at the same time and kind of go, that if the court ruled that 16 and 17-year-olds should be free from age discrimination, then therefore why can't 16-year-olds drink? There's a line in the sand that the government's drawn, and it's not the same thing. So what I'm trying to do, whilst kind of going, I may see an advantage in this because my political ideologies might be more likely to get to the front. I'm also going, what's the logic behind this? And why is the logic say 16, 17 and not 14, 15? Or why does the logic say free from age discrimination to vote, but not to drink? So I'm trying to maybe I'm taking half a step backwards and looking at it from a little bit further away, as opposed to specifically what's happened today, specifically around voting. Because what's going to happen to you guys, and I just put out a tweet that said, I hope you guys don't go on News Talk ZB this afternoon, because last time a teenage activist went on there in the form of Izzy Cook, she got abused and heckled and got trolled by the alt-right all over America. So I really hope you guys don't go on there, or by the time we play this out, haven't gone on there, because they're not good faith actors. But the truth is, people will be out there now looking to drive holes through this argument. And I guess, well, I'm not trying to do that from a what a bunch of dicks kind of point of view. I'm kind of going, I can see people are going to ask these questions, so I kind of want to know. I almost kind of want to give you the weapons you need today to go. When these questions come, and I'm sure you've had them already. How do you respond to why not a 14-year-old voting? Why not a 16-year-old drinking? Because that's all age discrimination still.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, this is the reason I love the podcast format. It really lets us dive into these a lot more deeply than a 5-minute interview over a phone call. And News Talk ZB has a lot of bad faith arguments. A lot of the opposition we face is bad faith. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to dissect there, right? In terms of the left swing, I think the reason there could be made a case for a left swing is because the issues that the left bloc prioritizes is almost always fighting for minority rights, fighting for like climate change, right? So in that, you just have like an intrinsic property of the left being able to appeal to young people more. But in saying that, I also don't know anyone who, or at least in my age group, who vote like I don't know people who wouldn't vote for national unless their parents voted for national, right? So there's still very much that cultural and social politicking that happens regardless of whether or not a group is a bloc. And saying that, right, young people are just a reflection of wider society. So all of those political reflections are still very much there, and those entrenched thoughts are very much there. So I wouldn't say it would be an incredibly significant left swing, even if we look at even if we look at it numerically. But I also think the reason so many parties on the right tend to come out with vitriol opposition is because they're almost afraid that they now have to appeal to a new voter base, or they have to be accountable to a new voter base. And
well, I think it's the other side of the same coin. It's not that they're scared that they have to appeal to another voter base. It's that they realize that their other voter base will go elsewhere. It's sort of the same thing, but they're looking at it from the other side.
They're looking at They're looking at it from the other side. And what I say here is, like, come on, guys, we can't oppose something because we disagree with it, right? We can't stop someone from expressing their view simply because it's a view that we don't agree with. That's like, it's just the fundamental part of democracy that people are going to vote differently from you. But I also hope it's a bit of a wake-up call to those parties to say, look, the closer we get to this reality, the closer you're going to have to start considering that young people want ideas. They want people advocating for them. They want
Sure.
someone that stands up for them. And if you're not going to do that, you're going to suffer political losses. And that's exactly why we say that voting for a 16, 17-year-old would make such a difference, is because every vote is an accountability measure. If you're not advocating, or if you're not acting in good faith for the communities that you're seeking to represent, then you're not going to get voted back in. It's as simple as that. So that's sort of on that sort of left-right divide and swing over there. In terms of other ages, I see where the whole 14 and 15-year-old thing comes in. I really do. And what I say to it is, if we have a voting age of 16 and 17, 14 and 15-year-olds, and for that matter, 12 to 13-year-olds, are going to be much more engaged in politics and civics education than they would be currently, which I think is probably a good step in the right direction to making a population that's super democratically engaged. In terms of, other things that we discriminate 16 and 17-year-olds from doing, right? Like, let's say, buying alcohol or something.
Sure.
It's an interesting thing, right? Where the High Court, initially, we failed because they said that, look, it is age discrimination, but it is justified age discrimination. That's the judgment they came up with. And so the sort of learning we take away from that is every legal age that we set out is done or should be done on a case-by-case basis. The logic we might apply for, let's say, the reason we have a youth justice system, rather than prosecuting 16 and 17-year-olds the same way we would, an adult offender, is because we believe that there is a better chance for rehabilitation, right? But then a separate case on a completely different basis can be made for voting, where it's like, look, these 16 and 17-year-olds are very much affected by the decisions that you're making, and are capable enough of, and the science back this, to make that decision. So we think it's reasonable to then give them the right to vote. So in that sort of lens, yeah, a lot of conversations should be happening about whether things are justified or whether they're not justified. But I think, no one else is advocating for the age to drink to be lowered, whereas people are advocating for the age of voting to be 16. So clearly,
so what I hear you saying is that the reason that you only fought for 16 and 17-year-olds is because you guys decided to fight for 16 and 17-year-olds. That was the line you just chose to draw in the sand, and that's what you're going for. So that's what you're going for. And any other questions around any other sort of age discrimination should be investigated of their own, for someone who wants to investigate that of their own. So it's not necessarily that what we're saying is, no one's used the word hypocritical, but you know what I mean. But that there seems to be a juxtaposition. Is that for today, the reason that you drew the line at 16 and 17 is because you drew the line at 16 and 17, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Look, if there's a legal basis to make that argument, then that's the legal basis we're going to take. But also, like, every sort of restriction we apply to any age group or demographic should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to see whether it stands up to the test of time, whether it's appropriate for the society that we live in. And voting is something that has to be evaluated because the challenges that we as a society face change over time. But the consumption of alcohol might be something that remains constant because of just like incredibly entrenched cultural feelings about the way we treat alcohol in this country. And that is also perfectly fine. So I don't think as a movement, we have to come out and say we have a position on A, B, C. But I think as a movement, we can come out and say that, look, at the very least, if we're making decisions about young people and the things that they're doing, we should have them at the decision-making table.
Yeah, and look, I think that's all absolutely spot on. Completely, you want to hear from the voice of people who are being affected by legislation. I'll tell you what I think I'll tell you what I think one of the issues is, not with what you guys are doing, but with the conversation being confusing for some. And I remember when I was at university, the drinking age was 20. Yeah, it got lowered to 18 while I was at university, and it was always very confusing because you could vote at 18, you could drink at 20. The university considered you an adult, i.e., for student allowance and stuff when you were 25, and there was a whole bunch of mixed messages as to when you're an adult. I think that, and I think that possibly the way around any of these conversations, should there be a pushback, is, well, let's decide when people are responsible for those adult decisions. And I think voting is an adult decision. It's something that is a responsibility of a well-functioning democracy, and let's apply all of the things to that age. Now that means, for example, there's for families and stuff, there's tax credits and stuff for kids at the moment. If we decided that age was going to be 17, then those tax credits would have to stop at 17, not 18, because that means we're making them everyone. That's the point of being an adult at that age. And I think one of the, not the problems, but one of the, I've said juxtaposition twice, but one of the things with this is 16 feels like a child in most areas of life. Voting feels like an adult interaction. And there's a mixed message there, at least for me. There will be a mixed message for many, unless we decide that at 16, that's actually when you're an adult. Now, that also means things like no more youth justice after 16. If you're an adult enough to vote, then you're adult enough in the eyes of the court. Maybe drinking. I'm not advocating for that at 16. If we figured out as a society and perhaps legislatively when someone was an adult, then probably all these questions would go away.
Yeah, you're probably right. It makes our job infinitely harder, though. I look, it's an interesting case, and we obviously this is something we have to deal with at the moment, right? This is a conversation we have to have. It's a funny thing. The age of majority legally in New Zealand is defined as 20, not 18. So there are mixed messages. I think the other angle you could potentially take here is to break away from the idea that voting is an inherently adult decision.
For sure.
And I think that's the push that we're trying to make here. That look, it's not about whether it's an adult decision or not. It's not tied. Like it's almost like the ideal voter is someone who is informed, someone who has access to quality information, someone who's able to independently make a decision, someone who's able to take feedback from the people around them and make their own opinions about what's happening. And sort of none of those things really can be universally applied to any age group, right? Otherwise,
no, for sure. Yeah, no, I agree.
And because otherwise we'd start bringing in things like a maximum voting age, right? Or we'd start looking at cognitive tests to determine whether someone should vote. Right?
Or you'd have to do a test on how much you know about the electorate before you vote, because you might be 35, but literally have never seen, heard, spoken about what the ramifications of your vote are. So no, I agree with you. Just because you're 16 doesn't mean you're any more or less informed than someone who's 25.
Exactly. So, and look, let's be real here. If there was a 7-year-old genius, right, who knew everything and anything about the world, they could probably make a better decision about some things than me or another adult, right?
I guess what we do, though, is in society we go, because we can't look at the 7-year-old genius or the 5% of 15-year-olds who are well informed. We look at what the trends say, and do the trends say that 20-year-olds are better informed than 16-year-olds when it comes to voting? Because let's be honest, and I don't mean to be patronizing to anyone who's 16. You don't need to worry about too much in the world when you're 16 for your own personal survival. Typically most 16-year-olds have a parent, they get looked after, their bills get paid, their food gets paid. Yet a 20-year-old, either working or at university, has a different perspective on the world and to where their tax dollars will go, for example.
And then I'll call into attention the the distinction between a 16 and 18-year-old, where the line is just quite a bit more blurred than it would be between a 16 and a 20-year-old.
For sure.
And then on top of that, I'd add, look, even if a 20-year-old is a little bit more informed, or has a job and tries to live independently, they're very much, and we can see this statistically, still not as engaged in politics as 16 and 17-year-olds would be, because they just don't come out to vote. So in that, right, we can keep on going back and forward between, some groups are more qualified to do this, some groups are more qualified to do this, but you're right. It's about the trend and direction of a group, or the trend and direction in society. And we know that suffrage generally increases over time. The amount of people that are brought to a decision-making table increases over time, because the issues and challenges of the day change. But also in that, I'd argue that we let 16 and 17-year-olds sort of leave home or leave school. Like, we say they're capable enough to make a decision like that, which is potentially life-changing. So there is basis there to say that, look, voting for an elected representative, probably less consequential than those decisions on a whole.
Like, I agree with you about 16 and 17-year-olds being more independent, but I think if we're looking at those trends and what we say across society, most 16-year-olds, most 17-year-olds are at home being looked after by a parent. So, and when I say most, I would say, I don't know these facts and figures. I could probably look up Stats New Zealand and find out it's going to be in the 90th percentile plus. So
in that, I completely agree, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a reasonable thing to say. I mean, it's a funny thing, I'm 18 right now, and I have, most of my peers are my age, right? So we're all still pretty much living at home, because it's almost impossible to find accommodation elsewhere.
Yeah,
right? We're living under our parents' roof. A lot of us started working when we were 16 and 17. Obviously not a big chunk of 16 and 17-year-olds, or even, most 16 and 17-year-olds would be employed, but some are still working. So that's the thing, right? The direction we have to take as a campaign is, let's separate this idea that somehow an age basis for voting is the single qualifying factor. Because the qualifying factors go a little bit deeper than what we generally legislate for on the surface.
Look, I think, can I be honest? I think you've got that wrong. And look, I hope you're taking this conversation as a bouncing around of ideas, because it's
sure.
I'm not against this, but I think you've got that wrong, because the only qualifying factor is age. That's the only qualifying factor, but that's the only qualifying factor there can be, whether it's 16 or 18. That's the only qualifying factor it can be, because any other qualifying factor would then rule out people of different ages as well. Like, if it was a knowledge based or whatever, then the 20-year-old who doesn't know what they're doing wouldn't be able to vote. So I actually think that both in practice and in reality, the only qualifying factor can be age. The question is, should that be 16?
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're saying, right? Like, basically my thinking is that 18 is outworn, right? We did it in 1974 or sometime in the 1970s. We moved it down to 18 because we had Vietnam, we had the Vietnam War, we had widespread student protests. It was globally what was happening as well. Like, that was just a global democratic trend. And in that, we said that the age should be changed, because this age group is very much clearly, not only capable of making those decisions, but is affected by the decisions. I'd also add, there's an interesting thing we read as something that's been tossed around inside the campaign. I think there was a Royal Commission report in sometime either like late 1980s or early 1990s. I don't have the date on me. And it was about MMP and, all of these new electoral rules that we're introducing. And a question was there about the voting age. And back then they were like, look, reasonably, we can make an argument that 16 and 17-year-olds would be able to make these decisions anyway. So back then, I think the reason it wasn't made 16 and 17 was because I don't think there was really a need or an outside push to have this new group come in to make those decisions, and B, because when you pointed this out, we probably legislated for 18 to be the age for most things, or the minimum age, and that changed over time. So, like I say, for country, like I look at a global context as well, for countries that have already lowered the voting age, there hasn't really been a change in the way they treat young people in, let's say, the youth justice system, or the way they treat drinking, right? Or ideas like that.
No, but I agree with you. I guess what I'm saying is, like, it would seem to be, and I'm not even talking about me necessarily, but it would seem to be an easier sell for people if there was consistency in the age discrimination. Because at the moment, there's lots of different ones, but understandably. Hey, look, answer me this. Where to from here? Because I think that I read in the story that ideally you'd like it in before 2023. I don't know how realistic that is, but I can tell you what, if it was after that, if you know, I mean, you have to probably argue that National are favourites to win next year at the moment. And if it was after that, I think your chances are far less in getting it through in the next term than in getting through in the next 12 months. Whereas a Green Labour coalition will probably get it through. You know, should it be decided to go through? What's the next steps? Is it going to be in place within 12 months, or where to from here?
Strategically speaking, I would say, look, because of that supermajority provision, that 75% threshold, it's still a really hard, it's still an uphill battle, right? But for local elections, on the other hand, we only need 51% of parliament. And the Future of Local Government report has already come out and said, look, you should lower it for 16 and 17. So I think it's very reasonable to maybe say for local elections, they do get lowered sometime before the next election. And by 2026, we can see it being lowered for all elections. But this is happening globally, right? This is a trend. We're very much riding a global advocacy wave, because a lot of European nations have started lowering the voting age for European parliamentary elections, and there are just emerging movements in Western democracies very similar to ours. A lot of counties in the US have lowered the voting age to 16. So it's just a part of a larger trend that isn't as large as maybe the voting age for 18 was, but it's still emergent and forthcoming. So
I mean, just on that, not to elongate the conversation anymore, I mean, here's the Wikipedia page of voting ages. It doesn't seem to be much of a trend voting for government. I mean, if you scroll down
there are 200 nations in the world. Like, I think when I say trend from a grassroots and advocacy point of view, we're not going to see a lot of change immediately, but it's a trend in that there are emergent movements coming up in a lot of different countries saying they want this change. And for countries like Germany, for example, it's a staged approach. It's a stacked approach where they will lower it for municipalities first, and then they will lower it for European parliamentary elections, and eventually they'll get it for all elections. So that's why I think 2026 is a much more reasonable timeline.
Yeah, and I guess that's what we were waiting to see. Hey, look, congratulations on the day, I guess, for you guys in and of itself. It must be an exciting day to get that Supreme Court ruling. Thanks for joining us today. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I do look forward to seeing where it goes from here. The co-director of Make It 16, Sanat Singh, it's been awesome. Thanks, dude.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Alrighty, there we go. I was pulling some comments along the bottom of the screen as that was going, but a few that came in towards the end there. Alex is not massively persuasive so far. It's very difficult for me to separate the responsibility and privilege of voting from the responsibilities and duties of being an adult in society. Yeah, I do. I understand you can make the argument that you want, you know, if we remove the idea of voting being an adult thing, then it's an easier argument to make it wide. But I guess if you remove it from being an adult thing, then what you're doing is you're making it a potentially child thing. And I don't think anyone would be okay with thinking about voting as something that children do. Do you know what I mean? Maybe I'm wrong with that. So Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Simon says, interesting fact that National Party allowed 12-year-olds to join their party. Nick says, only because if daddy. I guess that means if daddy's involved. And the response to Alex Politikiwi says, I mean, we don't already have a clear line between rights and responsibilities for quote-unquote adults. 17-year-olds can go to adult prison. 16-year-olds can drive cars with adults. Who's an adult? I think, I don't know if you've just joined in Politikiwi and missed like a little bit of that conversation, but that kind of the exact question that I just asked towards the end there. If we decided, when I say we, society decided what an adult was, then that would probably make it a lot easier to have these conversations with an obvious conclusion. All right, super quick before we go on to our second guest conversation. Second guest conversation is around hate speech and what's happened with the laws over the weekend, or late last week, I should say. But of course, Elon Musk is finally getting his sweaty little hands into Twitter in a more I was going to say a more changeable way, changing more. You will have heard about this towards the end of last week. Well, actually, just on the weekend, just yesterday, New Zealand time. He put a poll up, reinstate former President Trump, 15 million votes from memory. 52% said yes, 58% said no, to which he said the people have spoken. Trump will be reinstated. Trump was reinstated. Now, when he was reinstated, now I want you to keep an eye on the followers here, right? If you can see that, it's 87.3 million. When he was reinstated yesterday, I actually took a video of it on my phone. He had no followers. And maybe I'll email it to myself before this and I'll show you. And I refreshed it a couple of times and you just saw it jumping, jump. So I uploaded this page about an hour ago. So I'm going to hit refresh and see what Trump has happened to Trump in the last hour. He was at 87.3 million. Let's see if it has or hasn't changed. 87.3. It goes to 87.3. So there you go. Hasn't gone up in the last wee while. I tweeted out in the weekend, not to Elon Musk. I'm not one of these people to try and get Elon Musk to decide. But if he's going to start, if he thinks that we should run by polls, what else would we ask him to change? And which someone more important beat me to it as well. Daniel Oakfelder, and I got this from Stephen. Thanks for the tag in, Stephen. Responded to Elon's tweet about President Trump, as in indict former President Trump. There was a 2/3 to 1/3 yes to no. Now, one of the interesting things about this is President Trump is basically snubbing Elon's response. He hasn't got back into his Twitter account. Delay character. Anyway, it's one of those very few times, I have to be honest with you, that that actually Donald Trump seems to legitimately have the power position, which is kind of bizarre. Elon Musk is looking a little bit desperate and a little bit sort of, because he said you can come back and Donald Trump hasn't come back, and it's kind of egg on Musk's face, and he's putting up. So the thing about Elon Musk is he's actually a troll. And he's not. I'm being told there's no sound for that. That's all right. He basically just said, "I'm going back on Truth Social." Hopefully, you got to read with that as well. That's weird because we had sound before. Ugh. So Elon Musk is actually a troll. Other than if anyone trolls him, then he bans them, and he's beginning to look more and more and more desperate, wanting Donald Trump to come back to his platform now, because obviously he needs it. And he's putting up all these tweets and he thinks it's hilarious, but he's just looking sadder and sadder and sadder. It's I don't know. Looks like, I mean, if you're worth billions of dollars, that's something, but he's looking more and more and more like a bit of a loser, actually. He's losing in everything he does, literally in everything he does. Anyway, if there was no sound for that, I apologize. I don't know why. We just had sound, but that's okay because we are going on to something else now anyway. Hate speech laws have been changed. Have they been changed, or have they been? I think they have. There has been a change within the Human Rights Act to include religious groups as well. I had a chat with Max Tweedie. Max Tweedie is the director of Auckland Pride. He joined me this afternoon to have a chat about it because there are many within other communities who are going, hang on, we were pushing for inclusion in this. Now, I have some thoughts around hate speech laws. I really do. I'm not a huge fan of reducing speech. However, I can also understand there is a time and a place where it becomes an okay idea. So I kind of err towards more speech is better, but I'm not a free speech purist. So me and Max had a chat this afternoon about the legislation. He obviously represents the rainbow community. They were ignored in this legislative change. It looks like a really bizarre decision for the government to make, because why did it take 2 years going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards to all of a sudden go, oh yeah, we'll just go with the original recommendation from 2 years ago. It's quite bizarre. Again, now that you've made me nervous about the sound, I will watch to make sure that you can hear and see what is going on. But this is me having a chat with the director of Auckland Pride, Max Tweedie, this afternoon about the change to hate speech laws. Enjoy. The executive director of Auckland Pride is Max Tweedie. He joins me right now. G'day, Max. Kia ora. Hello. Welcome.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming very, very much. I've just, this weekend just gone, there's been like several massive stories that have come out that we're trying to cover off on, so much so that some of them are going to cross over until tomorrow's show to do with, National saying bring back work camps, or whatever the fuck they're saying. I don't know, whatever that is. So that'll wait. But today we're talking about lowering the youth voting age, which came out today. And on Friday, when we'd already planned a show, there was what is in the weekend actually, hate speech laws being changed, but not being changed anything like they were proposed to potentially be changed. I've got some thoughts around this, but I'd like to kind of just throw it to you to start off with, because the rainbow community was one of those communities that was said to be a recipient, if that's the right word, of changes for protections in hate speech law. So before we kind of get into the toing and froing of it, what do you want to speak to? What has, well, actually, I should probably go what has been proposed in case people haven't picked up on it. That would be what a professional broadcaster would do. So let me bring this up. Under current Human Rights Act, it is illegal to publish or distribute threatening, abusive, or insulting words likely to, quote, excite hostility against or, quote, bring into contempt any group of the grounds of color, race, ethnic or national origins. And the changes, they're bringing religious groups into there as well. They're basically literally adding a word. But the debate beforehand was, the rainbow community, the disabled community, and those groups are not going to be brought in. So now, much like a professional broadcaster would do, I've set it up. What would you like to speak to with that now understanding that we have today?
Yeah, and so we've been, I say we liberally, members of the rainbow community, activists, community organisations, have kind of been involved in this process since, I'd say 2019 was the first meeting that I remember that I was a part of with the Ministry of Justice on this issue. And what was being proposed or talked about at the time was a comprehensive new piece of legislation that was about, incitement to hate and different kind of provisions set out in this legislation, rather than a slight amendment to the existing provisions under the Human Rights Act, as some of those were seen to be an incredibly high threshold. I believe there's only been one prosecution under those laws before, and they've existed for about for quite a few years. So that was seen as quite a high threshold, and so government were consulting on bringing that threshold down a bit, and also including a raft of more marginalized communities into that. And yeah, you're right, the government's announcement on over the weekend was that A, that wouldn't be happening, but B, they would just be including religious groups into those protections, just in a specific response, I think, to the March 15 terror attack.
I'm sorry to use a sporting analogy, but I always do because I can't help myself. But like watching the All Blacks play England in the weekend, for those that don't know, it was a draw in the end, kind of felt like kissing your sister. It's just like really weird outcome. And this result now is sort of a bit the same. In fact, Newsroom wrote about this today. I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, but they coined a really interesting phrase. Oh, let me read this out to you. This is just one article, one paragraph from Mark Dolder's article on Newsroom. He says this: narrowing the scope of the protection to just religious groups, so we're talking about adding religious groups, will place a target on the back of religious minorities in an election year, whilst leaving many other vulnerable communities unprotected. So it's like, it's not the best of both worlds. It seems to be like the worst of both worlds that this legislation has come out with.
Yeah, that's quite right. I don't think anyone is particularly thrilled by this announcement. And I think, you know, Mark's analysis is right. And I mean, Mark's been an incredible writer on these issues of counterterrorism, extremism, etc. And so, you know, I think he's absolutely right to say that these religious minorities will feel the pressure of the culture wars around, you know, free speech and freedom that have been whipped up, I think, more recently in response to, you know, COVID-19 and the, you know, appropriate public health measures that were taken. And so I think it's really frustrating because, you know, on one hand, we've got, you know, communities that are then being singled out because of the one horrific incident that took place on the 15th of March, where, you know, 51 people lost their lives. And so the question is kind of raised, well, does that have to happen to every other marginalized community for that to be, is that the threshold? Because, you know, and then you look over, it is, and not one that doesn't, you know, to be honest, that feels pretty close to home at the moment. You know, overnight there was a mass shooting in a gay bar in Colorado Springs in the United States. You know, a 22-year-old who was radicalized probably on the internet. You know, and I think was a grandson allegedly, I think, of a MAGA state congressman, member of their house, and you know, this is not something that's far removed from the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing out of the United States and the impact that it has here. You know, one of the queer churches down in Greymouth was vandalized earlier this year with with homophobic and anti-Semitic remarks spray painted on the side. The Gender Dynamics and Rainbow Youth Hub in Tauranga was burnt down in an alleged arson attack. You know, earlier this year as well. These aren't hypotheticals that we're dealing with. We have seen this year 2 specific targeted attacks on very publicly queer buildings, and thank goodness there was no one in them.
Just so you know, so you're clear, my audience will be clear on this. When I like the free speech conversation, and for me, even though I don't think there's absolutes in this world in any case, shape, form whatsoever, I'm someone who, if there was a middle ground, which was 50%, and you could err on the side of like a few more restrictions for safety, or err on the side of more speech for open dialogue, I err on that side. But like I said, understanding that there's no absolutes, right? So I'm not sitting here like the whatever the freedom and speech coalition guy you were talking to this morning was, whatever that was all about. But it does always constantly bring me back to this conversation of like hate speech versus vile speech. And like homophobic slogans on buildings, which we all, well, certainly me, and I'm sure most of my audience abhor and think are repulsive and disgusting, is hate speech. And you said it earlier as well, the incitement to hate. I mean, people are allowed to hate people. People are allowed to encourage people to hate people. And or does it then equal into this area of that incitement to commit violent acts? And I guess for me, I'm unclear on what the legislations would do. And I'm not saying I'm applauding this, because one of my big frustrations with this conversation is it doesn't actually satiate anybody's concerns. Like, it hasn't protected the rainbow community anymore. It hasn't like delivered, I don't know, to the free speech purists what they want. And like I said, it really seems to be in the middle and not doing anything. And I wonder why this government with a majority wouldn't make, they've basically made no decision. They've added a word, yes, but they've basically made no decision, and how making no decision can be seen as useful to anybody in this plethora of opinion on this.
Well, you know, and even just the fact that you and I, two, I would say, politically engaged people having this discussion, don't understand the detail of what the government were originally going to propose, I think says a lot about the frustration that I have. And what I feel this government hasn't been able to do on a number of issues is make the argument. And I think that's what they haven't presented a case that said, actually, we need these provisions to prevent against XYZ, and actually we already do infringe on an absolute right to free speech in XYZ cases, and we do so because there's demonstrable harm caused if we allow the speech to you know, be disseminated. And so I think that's part of the problem I have, is that actually, you know, all that was that the conversation around this existed in a vacuum, that all the air, all the oxygen was being taken up by the Free Speech Union and people on the right who were scaremongering about the removal of speech in this, you know, terrible reality where, you know, you just chilling effect where you can't say what you think anymore, kind of thing. And I agree with you. This is vile speech. Is vile speech. I think it's reprehensible. I don't think it should be illegal. There's a difference for me, and I think the example that I used this morning, and I think really illustrates this point, is there was a pastor in 2017 who was investigated by police after saying that he doesn't have an issue with gay marriage so long as they're both shot in the head when they kiss. And he was investigated for that, but of course they couldn't do anything because there were no legal provisions against hate speech. Now that is a very clear example of speech that could lead or most likely lead to violence, and is very hateful in that kind of form of describing killing someone for who they are. That's the type of speech that I think I'm talking about, that our communities are talking about, this really, really hateful, violent speech. Not talking about slurs, writings on side of the buildings. No, that's not the type of society that we want to live in. But the way you create that society isn't just banning it wholesale and stopping that conversation. There is a line to be drawn here.
I think one of the problems with this conversation in general, and I'm not trying to message out kind of right-wing tropes. It's not what it's about, but it is a genuine question of mine, and I've asked it before, is who decides the intention of the speech as well? Like, you don't know my background, but I've been heavily involved in the church world. I've lost any opportunity to work in that world back in the past, which I used to do, because of my advocacy for same-sex marriage. People can just Google my name and LGBT issues, and you'll see all my writings about it. The example you've just given, which I heard you give this morning as well, which obviously I think is disgusting and revolting, but I also wonder, how was it said? What was the connotation? If it was, I mean, I'm not trying to defend that person. I don't want to, but if it was like, I'm okay having an Australian rugby player come over here, but only if we strung him up by the neck. What's the intention behind it? What's the audience? And I'm not saying this to defend him, but I'm like, abhorrent language that for one group of people feels like a danger and threat for the correct reasons, for obvious reasons, to another group might not. And then how do you balance that as well? And that's where the conversation, like for me, what I would need in to see of these law changes is not necessarily tight parameters, but really clear legislation. Like really clear, this is the line. So we don't have to worry, forget today, but let's say in 10 years from now, there's another complete group of politicians or lawmakers running the country that interpret what's made today in a very different way. So and I think without that really clear understanding, it's going to be very difficult for a government, be you a supporter of more hate speech laws or fewer, to get something over the line that society is going to go, oh yeah, I can see that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think, that opportunity is also lost, that's part of the select committee process, right? I mean, do I think, obviously Labor currently has a majority that could have sent that legislation as intended to a select committee to get feedback on, and then have come back and you could have come back and said, okay, look, we don't think we can do this in its current form. We have all these issues with it, yada, yada, yada. But they've just come out and said, oh, actually, we can't do this. And I think that's the kind of frustrating thing, is experts in law and, members of our community experience hate speech and the consequences of it, all haven't been able to come together in one mediated forum where we rely on facts and evidence and building legislation as part of our framework. We haven't had that opportunity. And that's, frustrating, because it feels like there hasn't been an opportunity for any of us to present the argument. I mean, I've been doing, a bunch of media today on why I think we should have hate speech laws, but there's been no impetus for me to do that before when they were considering it, because they never put anything up for consultation for the public to have a discussion. I'm talking about it now because the government have said, actually, no, we're not going to do it. And I think, that's the frustrating, piece for me is, and I think also the conversation around hate speech and the conversation about free speech generally, right, is so dictated by culture wars in the United States and the kind of, this absolute right that, people, believe that they have to free speech because they've, watched a few American movies and know about the First Amendment, right? There are so many ways in this country that we restrict free speech. I mean, we have a government position called a chief censor, for God's sakes. I mean, we have, in a variety of ways, limitations on the speech that we as New Zealanders, can or cannot say, and largely no one's debating those existing provisions, right? I mean, I take the example of libel laws and of defamation.
Yep.
I can't say something that's untrue about you that damages your reputation, but suddenly we put an individual's reputation on a higher pedestal than the lives, in some cases the lives and freedom of enjoyment of vulnerable communities. The balance, I think, is wrong. If we were having a very measured discussion about how we look at speech and within our legislative framework, I think we'd find a lot of contradictions in the kind of arguments that people like the Free Speech Union are making, and going, actually, how do we regulate speech in this country? Do we think that this is a good thing, and do we think that on balance this is a positive and reduce harm? And I think the overwhelming majority of cases where we do that in this country, it does reduce harm. And I do believe that hate speech would be another example, but I don't think we've had the opportunity to come together and hash out these issues of what crosses that line into speech that we would outlaw.
If you say anything about me that's not true, you don't have to worry, because I don't have a reputation. So it says nothing can be harmed. Hey, I was going to say, not that this matters, but if people are at all interested, 12 months ago, I actually did a conversation on hate speech laws right there. It's on This Is Our Other with and we did as other necessary with Paul Hunt from the Human Rights Commission debating one side of it, and Daphne Whitmore taking the con. The question was a recent Royal Commission. It's about the Royal Commission. Tonight we debate if hate speech laws are necessary, and we had Paul Hunt on one side and we had Daphne Whitmore on the other. So there's some people out there who have been talking about it, Max. There are some people. There's a couple of people out there who have been talking about it. Here's the one thing I was going to kind of wrap up with, because this is, and I'm not part of your rainbow community, yeah. But I kind of, and I don't, so I don't get it entirely, because it doesn't impact me. So I'm just being really honest and saying, I'm a cisgendered 6'4" white male who's never really suffered in the hands of being in public or being fearful for my safety or any of that kind of stuff. So I can empathize with it, and I can hear people's stories and understand, but I don't have a personal understanding of it, right? And saying all of that, there was something that I really offended me, almost, maybe the wrong word, upset me, from what the minister had to say in the weekend when she talked about this. Because even if I don't understand it, I hear your community, and I hear what your community says about the vulnerable nature of the rainbow community. And this is when she said this about including the religious community to legislation. This is what she said.
As we bring about these small changes to the Human Rights Act, is to ask political leaders to do what they can to minimise harm, make sure that we're looking after those most vulnerable within our communities, and let the debate that we have, let it be an intelligent, well-versed debate that's based on principles, not snap grab one-liners for media soundbites.
The thing that I found most sort of abhorrent about that sentence is her talking about the most vulnerable. So she's putting the religious community and identifying it as the most vulnerable. Now, there's sometimes debate out there about harms that are done and stats around harms that are done within the rainbow community. But I struggle to believe, from someone who understands a bit about religious communities, that the religious community in general are more vulnerable than many in the rainbow community. So I don't know how you felt about her saying that, but I took umbrage at it based on what I understand my friends and family and colleagues are saying, what they face within that community. And what I hear is, we're going to look after these people who are the most vulnerable, but the ones that I understand are more vulnerable, we'll leave them out. Whether the legislation is good, bad, or indifferent, just that idea that the religious community are basically the most vulnerable kind of fucked me off, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's frustrating, because obviously we're talking about huge groups with so many intersectionalities within them, right? Like, if you were to ask, me, if I thought as a cisgender white, gay man, if I felt more vulnerable than a Muslim individual after the March 15 attacks, I would say no, actually, okay, that Muslim person would have felt more vulnerable, right? And I think there are nuances obviously within this conversation, different intersectionalities that we bring to the vulnerable equation, if you like. And so I don't think that the government or the minister could sit there and quite rightly say,
you're being very polite, Max. You're being very polite, and because listen, the reason that, and I support my Muslim friends and community around me, but the reason that the Muslim community feels so vulnerable at the moment is because of a horrific act of terrorism committed on them on March 15th. I'm not the expert here, but when I stop and listen, the reason that I hear so many feel so vulnerable within the rainbow community is because it's hard for them to live their day-to-day life without any terrorist attack going on at all the time. So I understand what you're saying, and I'm not making that comment to disparage the Muslim community, but you wouldn't say the most vulnerable when it came to the Christian community. You wouldn't say the most vulnerable when it came to the Baha'i community. You wouldn't say, so it's because of a horrific act that the Muslims are at the top of the list, so to speak, and I'm there with them. But it's not just because of who they are and how they live that they're made to be vulnerable. It's because they were attacked in one horrific event. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I do think that for the minister to kind of say that we are protecting the most vulnerable by this announcement is not true. Again, my personal views on religion, of course, is that it is an individual choice for people. Obviously we in the rainbow community are not at liberty to choose who we are. And I think anyone that thinks we do, I don't know why in this current climate you think we would choose this way.
Yeah.
But that is the fundamental difference here. You are right. And do I believe that anyone should be persecuted or discriminated against because of that religion they chose? Absolutely not.
Yeah, I agree.
But to say that they are the most vulnerable, again, there are these nuances within it, but generally, do I agree with that statement? No, especially when it's in the context of excluding other vulnerable minority groups from hate speech legislation that it was kind of designed to protect.
Hey, Max, it's been so lovely to speak to you today. Anything you want to leave the audience with?
I don't think so, really. I just think it's been great to have these conversations with people, and I think we will continue to have these conversations. And I think this is a good thing, and I think it's it's important for us to continue to have as the minister said, kind of intelligent, well-reasoned discussions around these kind of laws and how they interact with each other. It's kind of a shame that we're having these conversations off the back of a decision that I disagree with. But hey, we don't know what the outcome of that law commission work will be that the government is undertaking with respect to the communities they left out of this announcement. And who knows whatever the outcome of the election is next year could well bring these changes in future, and I very much hope that's the case.
Yeah, well, I hope so too. I mean, yeah, we'll see what happens. But look, I was going to say, I feel sad that you haven't experienced much kind of public conversation with this other than when decisions are made. Don't be a stranger. You know where we are. Come on whenever you want. Come and tell us, update us, tell us what's going on, tell us what's happening, because we want to hear it. Even if you want to tell us about Auckland Pride and what's going on there, so we can tell people all about it. The 1st to the 26th of Feb next year for a big party.
Yes, no, and if you are based in TIMECODE, we for your audience and yourself, obviously, I don't know where you are based, but we are launching tomorrow in the Auckland Art Gallery for the 2023 festival. So if you're around, come to Auckland Art Gallery, Toa Tamaki, 7 p.m, and we've got some exciting things to launch tomorrow.
It's been amazing to have you on, Max. Max Tweedie is the Executive Director of Auckland Pride. Find out more about them at aucklandpride.org.nz. Max, thanks for joining us, man. Really appreciated it.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Pat.
Alrighty, that's pretty much us for today. Several comments that have been coming, and we'll get to actually comments that have been coming that have been covering sort of the gamut of what we've been talking about. I'm just having a look. Okay, I'll go to the ones that I've marked on the way. Mick seemed to have a bit of a vibe around words hurting. Said there, words can't hurt you unless you let them. So by telling people words don't matter, actions do unto others. Utter rubbish, complete and utter 100% bullshit nonsense. Not saying that to defend to attack you personally, Mick, but I believe one of the biggest lies we've ever been sold is sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. There is absolute bucketfuls of research out there that if you, and this is not necessarily hate speech I'm talking about here, but the point you've just made is words don't matter, right? And that's what I'm responding to, is that if you tell a kid for long enough they're stupid, no matter how smart they are, they'll grow up thinking they're stupid. Words can do massive damage to a person. In fact, that saying sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me is actually the opposite. Because you know what, a stick or a stone may break my bone, and 6 weeks later that's been reset, but it's the words that we get spoken over us, talked to us, pushed into us, that are often the things we're needing to sort the fuck out 20 or 30 years later, because they've got in deep. So the pure statement that words don't matter is utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. Now, the next question, though, is hate speech. So let's just remove the conversation around words don't matter. Words can be far more damaging to someone than a broken bone, right? Let's just put that aside now. For me, it's always a hard one to, well, it's not hard to talk about. I'll say whatever the fuck I want. But because I'm not part of a community that's marginalized or attacked, then my opinion is taken with a grain of salt, although I'm completely entitled to have it. For me, hate speech seems quite easy, and that's words that incite violence, right? Words that incite violence, and there has to be probably a credible threat for that as well. But even that sometimes is difficult, because if people are joking around online, it can come across the wrong way. So that's why I err towards more words rather than fewer, more speech rather than less, because it's not very black and white. We don't live in an idealistic world where we can just everyone's good and everyone's honorable. There's utter pricks out there, and those utter pricks out there sometimes try to harm. And I think this idea about just ignore it. It's not always easy to just ignore words. Some of us can do it. I've been told many times I've got very thick skin. I used to have people writing what do they call them, message boards about me when I worked on radio, massive amounts of them, saying abusive and terrible things about it. Never honestly never fazed me once. Other people, it's not quite so simple. Younger people, it's not quite so simple. People who aren't confident, it's not quite so simple. It's not quite so simple. Nick, talking about the 16-year-old voting, says testing it on local election sounds good, like a logical start. Melvin, talking about the voting, my concern would be if their high school teachers would be influencing who they vote for. These arguments are all well and good and fair, but then you could also argue about university lecturers influencing who they vote for. So, I'm not saying that a 16-year-old has the same mentality as a 19-year-old at university, but if there are arguments that can be made for both ages, does that make those arguments kind of null and void? Nick also talks about the religious one. Does it include atheism or agnosticism? I don't think either of those are religions. Like, if you look at religions or religious beliefs, there's probably a definition that has to do with organized religion, probably. But fair question. Politikiwi's been talking up a storm in the chat. It's good to see you in there, having a good chat there, Politikiwi. But was talking about the voting quite a bit, and then pivoted, as literally has been said, pivoted to hate speech for a second. I wish the court cases on hate speech at the moment were circulated so people could see the legal standard at the moment. We literally balance the question of human rights each time. And then back to the 16-year-old votings. My Health Hobbs says 2 questions. Are 16-year-olds really up to comprehending the nuances of politics and disinformation? Second question, are adults? Yeah, well, before I read your second question, Health, I was about to say that first question can be asked of a 35-year-old. Someone said something very rude in the comments about the people who were at Parliament and who were protesting at Parliament. Are they up to comprehending the nuance of politics? Fully grown adults, mature, all that sort of thing. One might say no. Geez, we're still going crazy in here. What about the likes of Richard Dawkins or old Christopher Hitchens? Would some of the things they say /sled be considered hate speech? Well, look, again, I'm not someone who is and we talked about this the other day. The problem that I find is many on the right, and I'm going to use that term, identifying it unfairly, want to have free speech so they can say shitty things to people. I feel like many on the left want to have free speech because they want to have authentic conversations. Now, that's not entirely, because there are many on the left, right? Many on the left who are also quite authoritarian. And the people on the left who are authoritarian also just want to squat. So the people on the right want free speech so they can call people, disgusting words. People on the left who are authoritarian, they want to inhibit free speech to what they think is protect people. And I think both of those situations are wrong. My concern around free speech is being able to have real, genuine, and authentic conversation and ask real questions. The problem is, in this day and age, people are being dishonest actors, to go back to that saying again, and they're not asking honest questions. They're trolling, and they want free speech so they can troll. Now, 2 steps backwards, that's not such a big deal for many of us, but for some it makes life more difficult. Yeah, but just for me personally, I keep using the word because I'm not a free speech purist. I err on the side of more speech, not less. More speech, not less. Yeah, more words, not fewer. That's where I go. Ava says, I couldn't tell you who a single one of my teachers voted for. Every boss I've ever had, though, tried to influence me. It's a very interesting point. Melvin says it's the authoritarianism that worries him. Yeah. Authoritarianism is certainly a concern. If you use Twitter, you're probably one of those trolls. Yeah, I have trolled on Twitter. I have. There's no question that I've trolled on Twitter, and I normally come on here and tell people about it because I find it fairly amusing. Okay, so let me share one more thing with you. We have to run long, but we're about to wrap up. I just wanted to bring something to your attention if you haven't seen it today, because there was another release of COVID numbers today, and the release today said that there was 24,068 new weekly COVID cases, right? So there's 2 things about that. The first thing is that is a 20% increase from last week, give or take. However, the ministry today has also released that last week they said that they believed 3/4 of infections were being reported. Today, they told staff that 35% of cases being reported was a more realistic figure. So that means rather than 25,000, give or take, last week, there was 75,000. That's 11,000 a day, give or take, between 10 and 11,000 a day. So just put it out there, letting you know that the official number at the moment is more like 10 to 11,000 a day of cases around New Zealand. If you're interested in protecting yourself and those around you, I would encourage you to look after yourself, and in doing so, help to look after the people around you, because it hasn't gone anywhere. It's still here. It is still here. All right, guys, I'm going to throw this up there as well, just because we can, because as you can see going across the bottom of the screen, thanks to our $50 patrons, and I want to say hello and thanks to our patrons. We had a good catch up in the weekend with, I think was there 4 of us, 3 or 4 of us catching up. It was fun, however many of us there were. If you're interested in supporting the work we do, if you've been watching tonight for the first time and you're a newbie and you like what you like what you see based on what we say, then we'd love to have you on board our Patreon, patreon.com/Big Hairy News. There's 7 layers of support you can get in there. There are actually, for you guys who are $50 per month, I'll email you this week because you're due some content, you're due some product, some merch, as it were, because that's one of the levels. So if you're a $50, then the guys on the bottom here, then I will be in touch this week to get you sent some stuff, even if you are Alex in the US watching this. Alex watches from the US, except he watches it in the next morning. So right now, Alex has gotten up in the morning to have his coffee and watch us, and we're talking about him. So Seattle, there you go. So I'll find out. I'll email you guys who are $50 patrons, and I will be in contact with you to get your merch. So they're all there. If you like what we're doing, we are obviously independent. Yeah, and it's a way you can help if you choose to. If you don't, all good. The other way you can help us is to be our advocates. Look at that. Where's that dog gone? Dog's left. Dog said when the dog is ready for bed, then I know that it's time to wrap up. Be our advocate. If you enjoyed what you've heard tonight, those 2 interviews will be up as individual clips on Twitter and on our YouTube channel. Share them around, and let's continue this conversation. All right, team. Been lovely to be with you tonight. I'll be back with you again tomorrow night from 10 p.m. for another edition of a big hairy news. And be well, be safe. Until we see you next time. Hooroo, my friends. Have a good one. A goodbye.